Hey guys, Lord Naren White here, the Holy Ghost, the one true God. Back with you with the next video in my series reading White Fang by Jack London. Without further ado, returning to White Fang as read by Lord Naren White. In point of fact, the cuff was rarely administered. The master's voice was sufficient. By it, White Fang knew whether he did right or not. By it, he trimmed his conduct and adjusted his actions. It was the compass by which he steered and learned to chart the manners of a new land and life. In the Northland, the only domesticated animal was the dog. All the other animals lived in the wild, and were, when not too formidable, lawful spoil for any dog. All his days White Fang had foraged among the live things for food. It did not enter his head that in the Southland it was otherwise. But this he was to learn early in his residence in Santa Clara Valley. Sauntering around the corner of the house in the early morning, he came upon a chicken that had escaped from the chicken yard. White Fang's natural impulse was to eat it. A couple of bounds, a flash of teeth, and a frightened squawk, and he had scooped in the adventurous fowl. It was farm bred and fat and tender, and White Fang licked his chops and decided that such fare was good for him. Such fare was good. Later in the day, he chanced upon another stray chicken near the stables. One of the grooms ran to the rescue. He did not know White Fang's breed, so for weapon he took the light buggy whip. At the first cut of the whip, White Fang left the chicken for the man. A club might have stopped White Fang, but not a whip. Silently, without flinching, he took a second cut in his forward rush. As he leaped for the throat, the groom cried out, "My God!" and staggered backward. He dropped the whip and shielded his throat with his arms. In consequence, his forearm was ripped open to the bone. The man was badly frightened. It was not so much White Fang's ferocity as it was his silence that unnerved the groom. Still protecting his throat and face with his torn and bleeding arm, he tried to retreat to the barn, and it would have gone hard with him had not Collie appeared on the scene. As she had saved Dick's life, she now saved the groom's. She rushed upon White Fang in frenzied wrath. She had been right. She had known better than the blundering gods. All her suspicions were justified. Here was the ancient marauder up to his old tricks again. The groom escaped into the stables, and White Fang backed away before Collie's wicked teeth, or presented his shoulder to them and circled round and round. But Collie did not give over, as was her wont, after a decent interval of chastisement. On the contrary, she grew more excited and angry every moment, until in the end, White Fang flung dignity to the winds and frankly fled away from her across the fields. He'll learn to leave the chickens alone, the master said. But I can't give him the lesson until I catch him in the act. 2 nights later came the act, but on a more generous scale than the master had anticipated. White Fang had observed closely the chicken yards and the habits of the chickens. In the night time, after they had gone to roost, he climbed to the top of a pile of newly hauled lumber. From there he gained the roof of a chicken house, passed over the ridgepole, and dropped to the ground inside. A moment later he was inside the house, and the slaughter began. In the morning, when the master came out onto the porch, 50 white leghorn hens laid out in a row by the groom greeted his eyes. He whistled to himself softly, first with surprise, and then at the end with admiration. His eyes were likewise greeted by White Fang, but about the latter there were no signs of shame nor guilt. He carried himself with pride, as though, forsooth, he had achieved a deed praiseworthy and meritorious. There was about him no consciousness of sin. The master's lips tightened as he faced the disagreeable task. Then he talked harshly to the unwitting spirit culprit, and in his voice there was nothing but godlike wrath. Also, he held White Fang's nose down to the slain hens, and at the same time cuffed him soundly. White Fang never raided a chicken roost again. It was against the law, and he had learned it. Then the master took him into the chicken yards. White Fang's natural impulse, when he saw the live flood fluttering about him and under his very nose, was to spring upon it. He continued the impulse, but was checked by the master's voice. They continued in the yards for half an hour. Time and again the impulse surged over White Fang, and each time as he yielded to it, he was checked by the master's voice. Thus it was he learned the law, and ere he left the domain of the chickens, he had learned to ignore their existence. You can never cure a chicken killer. Judge Scott shook his head sadly at luncheon table when his son narrated the lesson he had given White Fang. Once they've got the habit and the taste of blood. Again he shook his head sadly. But Weedon Scott did not agree with his father. I'll tell you what I'll do, he challenged firmly. I'll lock White Fang in with the chickens all afternoon. But think of the chickens, objected the judge. And furthermore, the son went on, for every chicken he kills, I'll pay you $1 gold coin of the realm. But you should penalize father, too, interposed Beth. Her sister seconded her, and a chorus of approval arose from around the table. Judge Scott nodded his head in agreement. All right, Weedon Scott pondered for a moment. And if, at the end of the afternoon, White Fang hasn't harmed a chicken, for every 10 minutes of the time he has spent in the yard, you will have to say to him, gravely and with deliberation, just as if you were sitting on the bench and solemnly passing judgment. White Fang, you are smarter than I thought. From hidden points of vantage, the family watched the performance. But it was a fizzle. Locked in the yard, and there deserted by the master, White Fang lay down and went to sleep. Once he got up and walked over to the trough for a drink of water, the chickens he calmly ignored. So far as he was concerned, they did not exist. At 4 o'clock, he executed a running jump, gained the roof of the chicken house, and leaped to the ground outside, whence he sauntered gravely to the house. He had learned the law, and on the porch before the delighted family, Judge Scott face to face with White Fang, and slowly and solemnly 16 times, White Fang, you are smarter than I thought. But it was the multiplicity of laws that befuddled White Fang and often brought him into disgrace. He had to learn that he must not touch the chickens that belonged to other gods. Then there were cats and rabbits and turkeys. All these he must let alone. In fact, when he had but partly learned the law, his impression was that he must leave all live things alone. Out in the back pasture, a quail could flutter up under his nose unharmed. All tense and trembling with eagerness and desire, he mastered his instinct and stood still. He was obeying the will of the gods. And then, one day, again out in the back pasture, he saw Dick start a jackrabbit and run it. The master himself was looking on and did not interfere. Nay, he encouraged White Fang to join in the chase. And thus, he learned there was no taboo on jackrabbits. In the end, he worked out the complete law. Between him and all domestic animals there must be no hostilities. If not amity, at least neutrality must obtain. But the other animals, the squirrels and quail and cottontails, were creatures of the wild who had never yielded allegiance to man. They were the lawful prey of any dog. It was only the tame that the gods protected, and between the tame deadly strife was not permitted. The gods held the power of life and death over their subjects, and the gods were jealous of their power. Life was complex in the Santa Clara Valley after the simplicities of the Northland, and the chief thing demanded by these intricacies of civilization was control, restraint, a poise of self that was as delicate as the fluttering of gossamer wings, and at the same time as rigid as steel. Life had 1,000 faces, and White Fang found he must meet them all. Thus, when he went to town into San Jose, running behind the carriage or loafing about the streets when the carriage stopped, life flowed past him, deep and wide and varied, continually impinging upon his senses, demanding of him instant and endless adjustments and correspondencies, and compelling him, almost always, to suppress his natural impulses. There were butcher shops where meat hung within reach. This meat must not be touched. There were cats at the houses the master visited that must be left alone, and there were dogs everywhere that snarled at him that he must not attack. And we'll go ahead and stop there for this week. As usual, I want to say thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Please like, comment, and subscribe, as it greatly helps the channel. Light be with you all. Take care, and Thanks again.